Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you. Good to be here. Thanks to Brian and his team for asking us to be a part of this. We appreciate it. I don't have any NFL funny stories or teams or anything, but I do have a joke my 11-year-old daughter told me just the other day before we came out here. Does anybody know what I'm getting some feedback here. Does anybody know what the blind fish said when he swam into a wall? Anybody? Oh, damn. Like I said, it's good to be with everybody this morning. With me on stage is Dave Vandegren and Doug Durante, who need no introductions. Their bios are in the guide, and you can read those if you're not familiar with them. We do have approximately 90 years of industry experience on stage, and just to put a little context to that, I've got about 8 years of industry experience, so you know where the expertise is, and it is deep and wide. I don't know anybody that knows or has been in DC working on behalf of ethanol more years than Doug, and Dave's been on the front lines for at least 40 years working on behalf of the industry. So we've got we definitely have some expertise here. My task this morning, though, is to guide a conversation on a forthcoming research project with which Urban Air has been involved. This was an effort to dig in at a level that had never been looked at before, to expose what has been decades of suppression of the fuel ethanol industry. The work has resulted in a series of detailed articles that will show what is beyond a reasonable doubt a concerted effort and perhaps even a conspiracy. We will use the word conspiracy that involves the EPA, the oil industry, and others. Shocker, huh? Doug and his team at CFDC has done most of the research, and they've done a lot of research over the last 120 to 180 days. Through Freedom of Information Act requests that Urban Air has done, petitions by UAI, and just plain digging deep and getting into the research, we've uncovered a disturbing pattern. Both Dave and Doug have witnessed this pattern over the years and are here today to share some of their experience and some of these findings. The findings will be distributed soon. We're working on a distribution plan, so stay tuned. Anybody that wants to make sure they receive the findings as they come out, let us know when we get your emails, and we'll get you on the distribution list. But let's start first with Doug, and Doug's going to give us some of the key highlights of the study.
All right, thank you. I need the clicker and the... Well, good morning, everyone. Ron will be passing out tinfoil hats after the presentation, but good to be back with friends here at ACE. Appreciate the opportunity to always visit with you and be with you and see so many old friends. As Trevor said, this is, and really building on what Brian said, you know, we're not in a good place. I mean, anyone we're going forward, but if we are, we're dog paddling. And, you know, we were sitting around with some of our members, CFTC, and a lot of people we talked to, and said, you know, what is it? I mean, at some point, you've got to say, you know, what exactly is going on here? And we threw out a pretty wide net to take a look at this, and we're working with the Farmers Union, working with Urban Air, working with, of course, our members. One of the reasons we did most of the research, because we're the oldest, I think. Todd Sneller and I and others have been around since the beginning of this, and we started going back, and as you said, Trevor, we see a very disturbing pattern. And when you look at what's keeping us down, obviously oil is a problem, big oil is a problem, the automakers are a problem. EPA, though, you take those two things and you put them into EPA, and that's the bigger problem. And we've gone back and seen that for really since the Clean Air Act 28 years ago, at best they've been unhelpful, and at worst they've been obstructionists. So we need to move beyond that. They have concocted fake fuels that produce fake results that penalize our product, and we are unfairly maligned in the scientific world in terms of emissions and everywhere else, and we're going to take it to them on that. They have worked with big oil to thwart competition. It's not a question of whether they colluded. It's clear they have. They admit that they have. So, and as Rudy Giuliani said about the president, he started backpedaling on collusion. He said, well, is that even a crime? Well, I'm not here to say whether it's a crime or not, but it's a fact, and they did that, and they've worked with them at our expense. And when you think about where we are after 100 years of innovation in everything in our lives, the one thing we haven't innovated and gone forward on is gasoline. So that's one of the things that got us to bear down on this. If everybody knew what we know in this room about the good parts, and we are the good guys, we wouldn't be where we are. But they don't, and we're going to change that, and we need to lead that charge, as Brian alluded to, and Dave will talk about a little bit more. It is clear that EPA, when you go back and look at this series that we've put together, has embraced a culture of roadblocks, delays. They've ignored and downplayed the public health risks, which are a key part of this thing. Their rule interpretations, their collusion with big oil, the way they develop regulations, the things that they do, failing to recognize even the key role of mobile sources, and all of that has come, again, at our expense. And the reason we're doing this series, and the reason we're putting this together, and the reason we're going forward is we found the smoking gun. Through a lot of the legal work that Urban Air had done, through Boyd and Gray Associates, and a lot of you know they've been here before, we filed numerous Freedom of Information requests, and we've had a lot of complaints and petitions and all kinds of things. And we have a body of evidence that's undeniable, and that is the smoking gun with these 10,000 emails and other things that all will be in the series. You can link to them and read internal emails from EPA to the oil guys. So the objective of our project was to provide enough information in the court of public opinion to show that there's a serious health risk because of the amount of toxics in gasoline, and that's where this all goes back to, and the aromatic content and the benzene that it produces, and the benzene that's in the fuel, the benzene that's produced by exhaust emissions. And we clean that up, yet the way that they've run us through the test, we're unfairly penalized for that. It's an inaccurate portrayal of our ability to clean the air, and again, at our expense, and we're just not going to take it anymore. So we want to provide a complete and documented history of this problem. It goes all the way back to the Clean Air Act. The target audience for this series is above the guy on the street. We want to attract some outside journalists, some outside people to take a look at this, and any reasonable person, which is one of the titles we have for this, Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, can see that this is not a square deal for us. And as our president says, he uses this term all the time, if I find out something's been treated unfairly, we're going to deal with it. And we found out, and that's why we're doing what we're doing. So what did we find? Well, again, as Trevor said, months and months and months and months of research, and we've thrown a wide net. We've talked to a lot of people and gone back to our own archives, and all the way back to the Clean Air Act. And what we've developed is an 8-part series that we are calling Gasoline Gate. And I know that some people snicker at that, and it may seem a little trite, but it is, and everything that seems to have a cover-up or seems to have some kind of collusion behind it often gets the gate term, but it's fitting here. And just quickly to go through this, we have an 8-part series that's going to be coming out because it is too much to digest in one piece. And the first part is that we're making the case that EPA has circumvented energy, environment, national security. We've gone back, and over a 10-year period, there were 11 major pieces of legislation that favored and emphasized ethanol. And that's not reflected in the things that EPA does. The Clean Air Act just recently actually came out with a new cost-benefit analysis and said that for every dollar spent, there's $30 in benefits. But we can show in the fuel market where you would get those benefits, and they have consistently and repeatedly ignored toxics. You look at the quote here from Senator Daschle back in 1990, where he was hammering on EPA to get toxics out of gasoline. You look at this quote 13 years later from a Republican from a totally different part of the country that says, look, EPA is hiding data, they have their own agenda, they're not doing what we want them to do. A newer quote, we didn't even get a chance to work it in here, from Grassley recently, same thing. He said API and the petroleum industry has EPA and Washington wired. So this is not us wearing the silver hats. It's there. It's just no one has put all this together. So the next part of section 2 on this is what we call the Trail of Tears, where we went through and said, okay, just exactly how were we treated unfairly? And we go through in excruciating detail every time they had a chance to help us and to take a rule and err on the side of ethanol or do something a little bit favorable, they went the other way. And it's documented, and we have the email trails, we make the case for that, we explain that. And again, it's not a question, do they collaborate? They clearly collaborated. So the question then is it a conspiracy, or is it just incompetence? Is it a deep state resistance to ethanol? Are they just not like us? Probably all of those things. But so then the next section in part 3 is we say, okay, well, what happened? What did we all lose out on? And that's where we really get into the health effects on this, and we really get into some numbers that are undeniable about not only air pollution and the deaths and the premature deaths and things that are linked to air pollution, but the fact is linked to fuel. And they absolutely undervalue fuel when they look at their models and they come back with a clean power plant or something like that and they say, we fixed the problem. So no, the biggest part of the problem is still lying there. And so that's one of the things that we really get into, and it's the same history. If you look, as we do in here, what happened with tobacco, what happened with lead, and what happened with aromatics. It's dragging your feet, and it's bought science, and it's fake science, and it's really a collusion by them with the people that they should be regulating. So the next part of the series in section 4, same thing. We get into the health care a little bit. Conservative estimates are that, we're talking about trillions of dollars that could be saved, and the cost on each gallon of health care that reputable studies have come up with shows that we could have a tremendous savings. Since 1990, there's a trillion gallons of aromatics floating around in the pool, 30 billion gallons of benzene. And when you go back through our stuff, it was clear in the late 80s and early 90s, these members of Congress said, get this stuff out of gasoline. I've got a letter from a high-ranking official at EPA where he says, well, geez, we've reduced benzene by a third. A third? A third over 28 years? A third? Why do we have it at all? So, again, this is just a question of making the case that they haven't helped us. So as we go through this, in the readily available alternative, as you see there in part 5, it was known. It was known early on that ethanol was a cleaner octane source. And this is no mistake. We have records back from the late 80s where reputable medical professionals came to them and said, not only do you have benzene in your gasoline for octane, but we have benzene being formed by the emissions from all these other things in gasoline. We got to clean it up. And again, they always took the least amount of action, and again, to our detriment. And so now we get into Dieselgate, and Dave is going to talk a little bit about more, why do we call it a Dieselgate? Why do we call it a cover-up? Well, you look at the Volkswagen thing, and what was that? 500,000 cars. We have 260 or 270 million cars, internal combustion engine cars on the road, and we're going to have them for a long time. I don't care what anybody says about electrics. We're going to have a lot of cars that need a lot of gasoline for a long time. So this is a proportional problem that people just don't even have any comprehension of. If you think pulling 500,000 diesel cars off the road is going to clean the air, again, they're ignoring the elephant in the room. And again, we have these emails. One I couldn't help but highlight here is that EPA highlighted in one email, they said, they're talking to the oil guys back and forth, shaping the tests and the emissions test and creating the parameters for those tests. And they say in the email, we don't have the technical capability to do the policy advice and the regulatory advice that we're supposed to do, so we need you guys to do it. So they have brought in the oil guys to fashion the tests that determine our future. That's like if I had a new cola I'm trying to bring onto the market, I go to the Food and Drug Administration, ask them to approve it, and they call Coca-Cola in. So what do you think of this guy's cola? Well, what do you think he's going to say? I mean, they don't want that competition. And again, this is just time after time after time. And part of that we're very upset about, that last bullet on part 6, is they have violated a number of laws and requirements as to scientific integrity, Federal Advisory Act Committee protocols where you're supposed to have a balanced view. We've asked through our technical guys many times to be involved in these tests. We go back in some of the history. There was one blurb we put in there where they had 32 meetings with oil guys during one of the Clean Air Act revisions and none with ethanol. So again, they have violated the law without question on that particular provision, the Federal Advisory Act, and we may go after them on that too. So, and then the last part, which so many of you in this room can relate to, is really how they worked with oil and together fought us. And this again upsets me a great deal. But if you look at what we call the revolving door process, there are 763 registered lobbyists in D.C., and if you do the math, that's one for every single member of Congress, every single committee, and every single federal agency that covers these issues. So they've got the town blanketed, and most of them are ex-oil guys. There's just a number of petroleum people that are going in and out of this revolving door. They go in EPA for a while, they go back to industry, they go back and forth. The head of the petroleum refiners right now was former general counsel at EPA. The head of API was chief of staff to John Boehner when he was Speaker of the House. So you think these guys have Washington wired? I mean, that's pretty high level stuff. So we wonder why maybe we're losing here. We've got the truth, but they do have the money. And in this series, you'll be fascinated to see the spike up in spending after the RFS. It's astounding, just the money that they started spending the minute that we passed the RFS. So that's something else. We have this. These are all documented dollars, documented figures. And of course, it's not over. API has on their website that one of their objectives is to repeal and get rid of the RFS. So this isn't stopping. But the pattern, a 28-year pattern of all the things I'm talking about, is undeniable, and it is beyond a reasonable doubt. And you have to look at these guys in these federal agencies have broad, sweeping powers. They can introduce a rule anytime they want if they feel it furthers their agency's objectives. And there have been so many things that they could have done to help us. And as I said, one of the early sections, the Trail of Tears, and every time they could have, they didn't. We're seeing it today. We're seeing the Department of Energy has proposed a rule to repeal the Obama administration's light bulb rule, where they had passed this incandescent light bulb thing where you had to use more energy efficient. They said, we just think they misinterpreted it. That's the kind of power they have. We don't ever get that. That never comes to us. When have they ever said, as we've asked them to do, say, we want you to reread the RVP language? And it's easy to make a case that needs to be reinterpreted. We think that it's been misinterpreted all along. No. So again, just this deep state in deep resistance against our product, and it's not fair. And a lot of it ties to oil money and the things they've done. And the doublespeak of the oil guys, I got to make sure I mention this because I was just so struck. In our historical research, we found an ad by Bob Hope. Now, most of us are old enough in this room to know that Bob Hope, along with Walter Cronkite and maybe John Wayne, was one of the most revered people in this country. He entertained the troops. He was a face known globally. He did commercials for Texaco touting the fact that they had ethanol in their gasoline. We have it. We have a tape. We have a link to it on this series where you can watch him actually say that. So here the oil companies are double speaking on this and touting it when they want to and when they want to get those margins that we talked about, but then running behind and going to EPA and screwing up the tests and hurting us in that way. So that's the series. It's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks. We're just within the next few weeks. We're fine-tuning it. We're just putting the finishing touches on it. We've talked to reporters right up to the Washington Post. We've talked to people with outside our industry. Our hope was that somebody would say, look, I don't even know anything about your industry, but I can smell a rat. I can see a pattern of unfairness and misuse of these agencies' powers. And that's what we hope to do, and I think we're going to do that. But to wrap up with this part of it, so why is okay, so what does all this mean? What is at stake? Well, as Brian said and as Ron said, there's things ahead of us, but we've got to go get them. We have to get those. The key thing that's here, and we'll talk a little bit more as we go on, is octane. And one of the questions we have to ask is the new octane demand going to be met from the cornfield or the oil barrel? And we know we can meet it from the cornfield if we're given a fair shake. And it's very important because the health aspects and the aromatics of this that are in this fuel, just on a volume basis, we replace that, it would significantly increase the market. This is really a key chart for you all to look at. RFS there at this period here, you can see where the petroleum industry started reducing their volume. reducing their volume in order to accommodate our ethanol. We filled that job. There was a job opening there for octane. And remember that this was, we removed the oxygen requirement from the Clean Air Act when we did the RFS. That was sort of what I call the hostage exchange. We sent over the oxygen standard and they sent over the renewable requirement. But they didn't have to use it. They could have met their requirements somewhere else, but obviously we were the winner there. This is the next battlefield. This is where we need to figure out, is this where we're going, above that line? And there are a number of things on the table right now, the CAFE bill, that we can capitalize on, but we got to go back to the basics, which is the health aspect. The aromatics, the toxics, get this stuff out of gasoline, and when you do, we're the only guys that can fill that job description. So that's why it's so important, and we're going to, again, talk a bit more about it. And again, Dave knows a lot more about this and our technical guys, but you don't have to be very technical to understand this. They take a fuel. Why do they come back and say that our test results are bad and we pollute, and that's why you can't use more ethanol? Because they hold us up against something that doesn't exist. It's a fake fuel that's as pure as the driven snow, as opposed to consumer fuel that has all kinds of other things in it. And this match blending versus splash blending, if we put our ethanol on top of finished fuel, it makes it better. But that's not how they test it. And that is unfair, and we're challenging them on that. And it is absolutely a backdoor way to keep our industry down. So I'll stop here and we'll get some discussion going, and Dave, but this is really what we came up with. I mean, one of the reasons we harp on benzene, in this top right-hand corner you can see, is benzene is back in 1948. This was a startling admission by API at a hearing. Somebody asked them, they said, well, what's a safe level for benzene? They said, there really isn't. But we have benzene in our gasoline. We have benzene formed by the emissions that come out of the other aromatics from the tailpipe. And again, what has EPA done aggressively to not only reduce that, but to further our other objectives? And one of the things I want to make sure people understand, when we created the RFS, it was an amendment to the Clean Air Act, but it was through the Energy Security Bill. And it was abundantly clear that these two things had to work together. We have energy goals. We have an objective of replacing oil, and we have an objective of domestic energy and creating, creating jobs and all the things we do. And that should always be the tiebreaker for EPA. That's why they never err on the side of ethanol, where they should, because they are charged with linking up these multiple public policy objectives, and they don't do that. They don't even kind of do it. So again, and in fact they do the opposite. They've removed alternative fuel credits. They have a rule that's floating around from the Obama administration, but it's still alive, that would limit, but by definition, the use of E15 and higher blends to flex fuel vehicles only. So even if we had higher blends, 20, 30, at least where this rule would go. And then, like I said, the salt in the wound is, by the way, we're removing flex fuel vehicle credits, so there would be nowhere to put it. So again, there's just a history of that. But octane is important. We did get rid of lead. We know we can do these things. Dave, you can talk a bit about that fuel on the left, of how the fuel samples and how it really, again, makes us look bad, when in reality, if you do the tests that we would do them, supported by the auto industry, at one point came forward and said, nobody would ever test fuels like that. Why is EPA doing that? So I'm going to stop here, but I know it's a lot to absorb, but I think you're going to like this series. It was an extensive, well-documented, hundreds of footnotes, and we all need to put that out there and use the rhetoric that we hear on the road and in the news every day. We are being treated unfairly. And the objectives of our Congress and our administration to create jobs and domestic fuel and energy security, which is national security, we can contribute to all those things with a healthier fuel, but they need to open the market. And this is an absolute travesty, we think, of how they've kept us out. So let me take a breath here, and Dave, and we'll go from here.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you.
Dave, a couple questions for you. a couple questions for you, and one's maybe just more of a comment than an answer, but we talk a lot about, and we heard Brian say today, oil keeps getting win after win after win after win. And we make a little bit of progress here, we make a little bit of progress there, but we don't put any big wins on the board like oil does. Is it fair to say that given what we've learned from this research, is it fair to say that a system has been created, maybe even rigged, to achieve the results that it's achieving?
Well, I don't know how many of you are aware of what Dieselgate is and why we picked that gasoline gate as a tagline. Well, what you really have, and with this slide up here, it kind of shows, if you Dieselgate, what they did is they developed a defeat device that when the car went on the dyno for their checking emissions and checking performance of that engine, the computer sensed that the steering wheel was not moving, so it went into what we call a limp mode, and it would then pass emissions. Now, that wasn't putting enough fuel in the car to go down the road, but it was putting enough fuel in the car to run on the dyno. The EPA basically did the same thing in a different way. The defeat device for EPA was the fuel. When you look at the EPA cert fuel on the left, it is twice as good as the average consumer fuel on the right. So when EPA certifies Ford, GM, Toyota, Chrysler, all of the different autos that come into this country, it's tested with the blue fuel, and that is the numbers that EPA uses for tailpipe emissions for all vehicles around the U.S. And what you clearly see there is that the actual emissions off of those cars is twice as high. Now, this work was started about, I'm going to say 8 to 10 years ago. Steve Vandergren, my brother, is the what I would call the expert on fuel. Really understands fuel throughout the United States and how it's produced, how it's made. What does consumer fuel look like? What does EPA fuel look like? And that really, the collection of that data, the question asking, the analyzing of different fuels, analyzing all of the test work that CRC does which is an oil-funded research group, supposedly independent, who does most of the research work for the EPA, does most of the testing for EPA, and their data is what supplies EPA with the information to put together their regulations for each state. And so this has been what I would call a very intense, long, ongoing process of really trying to identify why adding ethanol to gasoline always makes the gasoline worse, according to EPA and CRC. And what you could see, go back to the next one if you would, Doug. No, the next one. There we go, that one. If you look down in the lower left-hand corner there, you see the blue is the volume of gasoline, okay? And as the volume of gasoline, you look to the right on the red, that says where do the emissions come from in that gasoline. And what you're seeing there is 15% of the gasoline produces 70% of the tailpipe emissions. So when they take this blue gasoline and they add 10% ethanol, what do? They put some more aromatics in the 300 to 400 and 400 plus range, and they can make E10 look worse than E0. They can make E15 look worse than E10. That's the process that EPA uses to vilify our fuel additive. And they have been extremely successful at that for many, many years. That is the, again, that is the data that has been collected and put together in the series that CRC will be putting out again starting probably next week. And we will be getting that out to the general public, and we hope that this exposure of this flawed testing will raise awareness with influential people so that we can begin that process of demonstrating that we do have a clean fuel, we have a good fuel, and adding this to, I don't care what gas you add ethanol to, you will make that gas better.
Thanks, Dave. Doug, we didn't talk about this, but I want to throw it at you. I know you've got it. There was a small line in one of your slides that says API's intent or wants to kill Section 202L, and that's a section of the Clean Air Act. We know, we've seen documents from oil companies that have specifically said they want to do away with the anti-backsliding rules. Why is this significant? As we look at this huge octane opportunity in front of us, and essentially it's ours to go get, why are these little details like 202L and anti-backsliding, why are those incredibly significant to what we're trying to accomplish?
Well, 202L is a section of the Clean Air Act that we sometimes joke about because it was overwhelmingly passed by 69-31. Is that the count, Dave?
69-30.
69-30. We always hear the vote count. But it was a Daschle amendment. It was a Daschle-Dole-Harkins. It was a bipartisan amendment. I was very involved on the House side of it. It was also bipartisan over there. We went over and got a companion bill. And what it says is it says that essentially Congress made their own endangerment finding, and they instructed EPA to regulate and lower toxics. And they didn't say from time to time you may, or from time to time you should review it. It says you shall do this as technologies become available. Technologies include better fuels, and ethanol was a better fuel. So they did a review of this in 2007, and at the time, here's a perfect example of how you can make anything come out the way you want, depending on what you plug in. They have to do a cost-benefit analysis, whether it's on lives per gallon or, there's a number of ways they measure it. But the inputs to that, they said, gee, ethanol is a great replacement for these toxics. It's a terrific replacement. And this is 2007, so we hadn't gotten into RFS 2 yet. So we don't have enough ethanol, and oil is $19 a barrel. So ethanol would be short. Oil is so cheap that the cost benefit doesn't come out. Well, of course, we've turned that on its ear immediately afterwards. And again, here's something, if they wanted to be helpful, they could go do it. The oil, to your question, Trevor, the petroleum industry knows that. They know we got a ton of ethanol. They admit that it is the cheapest source of octane. They'll tell you that to your face. They know it's coming. But that octane would only be in demand if it's clean octane. So they want to get rid of these provisions that keep you from dumping the dirty stuff out into the gasoline pool, and they literally would like to get rid of that provision. I think Brian or Ron alluded to, every time we try to have an initiative that moves us forward, they seem to package it with things they like. Okay, we'll do that if you get rid of all these other things. So that's a critical piece of the octane market. It's octane for octane's sake, and in fact, it's a little bit more important, I think, right now, because if we freeze the CAFE standards, as is being discussed, somebody could argue that, okay, well, efficiency, which is the other part of the coin, we can make cars, enable these guys to make cars that are more high efficient, high compression rather, get better mileage. Well, if you're not trying to get better mileage, then that takes that value proposition out. So we have to go back to the health. We can't give that up. We've taken that on and we can't give it up. And they know that, and they want to get rid of that. So they're throwing all these little things and thinking that we don't know that.
Because if they can get rid of that, then they can just add more benzene, more toluene, more of the dirty stuff to get their octane, rather than
absolutely
the clean octane.
Dave, what have you called it in the past? The mobile incinerator?
Yeah. I mean, that's what we have. Every one of you drove one here today. A mobile incinerator for the petroleum industry. Those items on the right are things that they produce in the refinery, and the best place to get rid of them is in gasoline. And if they are forced to take them out, then that's going to reduce their profitability.
Good.
But we do have to bear in mind, you know, there's health issues. Autism is on the rise, low birth weight, child competency is all of these things are tied to air quality.
All right, thanks. Well, Dave, we got about 10 or 15 minutes left. You've been on the front lines for 40 years. Your heart is deep in agriculture, and you're a man of action. Anybody that's ever worked for you knows that you're a man of action. I know you have some ideas that you'd like to share with us today on just what we can do to take action and move the needle, as you like to say.
I probably need 2 mics, but anyway, when I was asked to be on this panel and to speak here, so I started writing. Well, I wrote, by the time I got done, I had 16 pages, which was too much that Brian said I could not read all 16 pages here. So we do have a copy of this on the Urban Air website. I also have about 15 copies with me if you would like to look at it and read it. What I'm going to try and do here is give a bit of a summary of what's in here and give you a closing proposition that I think is valuable to consider, because what have we learned? What is the largest non-competitive business in the United States today? Anyone want to take a jump at that one? Government. Government is, they produce no revenue. They produce no wealth. And then they confiscate it from those of us that do. So what's the effect on agriculture from that? Kind of about everything. And what's the second largest industry in the world? Energy. Big oil. Both of these in collaboration together, they incentivize the least amount of competition. In our case, with government and big oil, they block competition. Why in the post 9/11 time that we're in now, do we continue to make countries that hate us wealthy? What about America First that President Trump keeps talking about? What's that about if rural America is not included? Shouldn't some of the money exported to buy oil stay here and be reinvested in our rural economy? Yes, we have a robust export right now, but we're lucky we have that. Without that, we would be in a big challenge. And we're dealing with trade wars now with Canada, with Mexico, Europe, China. What's the currency for all of those trade wars? Agriculture, ag products. That's what we export the most of. That's what we are. We can feed the world, but we can also fuel the world. We're seeing huge increases in our production of all of our crops and our efficiencies and everything else. We can continue to do both if we're allowed to. Most of you know, Dennis and I did not get into this business to see what we could get out of it. We got into this business because we saw an opportunity for sustainable agriculture. Growing up on the farm, being a part of agriculture through all that time, it may sound like a nice buzzword to be saying sustainable agriculture, but what does sustainable agriculture really mean? It means markets for our crops. It means jobs in the rural community. It means money stays in our area, stays in the small towns, promotes family farming, all of the things that were near and dear to my dad and probably near and dear to a lot of you guys here in the room. And we need to, in my view, have a paradigm shift. We need to get away from the cronyism that are in Washington. You've seen it, you heard it, the amount of lobbyists that are there, the challenges we have, the manipulation of fuels and things like this, all to hold agriculture down. And the swamp that's there, freedom can work if you let it. We need our states to work with us and go to bat for us for our product in our local areas. Rural America should not continue to live in crisis mode. We started this industry. Agriculture started this industry, and we need to take back control of our own future. History teaches government doesn't give, they just take. And that has been demonstrated in our industry time and time again. And there's four kind of key areas that I believe we are held hostage that I'll try and highlight here. Number one, as consumers, we're held hostage. Big oil not only blocks better fuel, but they block better prices. One of the things to keep in mind, the last 5 recessions that we had, each of them was preceded by a rise in oil prices. Oil has gone up 20% since the beginning of this year. What does that mean? I'm not here saying we're going to have another recession. I'm just stating what history tells us. Analysts are saying, you know, it's up because of the Iran deal. Really? Now just think about it. It's a country that hates us. It's a country that can't compete, except if maybe we're on the wrestling match. And they can hold us hostage. How asinine is that? Memorial Day 2017 to Memorial Day 2018. Price of gasoline went up 31%. At the same time, price of ethanol went down 4.5%. There's a slide in here that goes through that and shows that 70 cents that was referenced earlier gap between the price of our product and the rack price of gasoline. If in fact we were able to get some of that, if our fuel just stayed parity, I mean, why does not fuel follow fuel? Good question. But if our fuel just followed fuel, that'd be 60 cents at least more for our ethanol. What does that relate to for agriculture? That comes back to $1.50 extra value in the corn. You know, what would that do for agriculture in the Midwest if we could garner an extra $1.50 for our corn? Be a big difference that we could expect. Big oil, on the other hand, last quarter made $8 billion. They're selling gasoline, ethanol free, no ethanol gas in Wichita, 41 cents higher than E10. Now think about that. They save 4 to 6 cents making an 85 Bob gasoline compared to an 87 Bob gasoline, and they charge the consumer 41 cents more to have ethanol free gas. I don't know what your opinion of that is, but I do know in Wichita there's a lot of oil refining, and there are people that absolutely will not put ethanol in their car. Those people are going to buy ethanol-free gas no matter what it costs, and the petroleum industry can gouge them, and guess what? That's exactly what they do. Why do they do that? Because they can. So gas prices have doubled since the mid-90s. Corn prices are back to the mid-90s. My friend, that's how you make $8 billion a quarter. And again, number 2, rural America held hostage. Okay? In pre-renewable era, rural America population dropped 14%, while at the same time the national urban population went up 27%. We lost young adults at twice that rate. 4 in 10 were born into poverty. The median income of rural America was $20,000 less than the national average. Now let's roll the clock ahead to now. The income of rural America is about 10% above the national average. However, that's going to be short-lived if we do not expand our agricultural product value. We'll again lose our young talent. And if rural America goes south, the rest of the country won't be far behind. A couple of years ago, Glacial Lakes and ICM partnered to do an E30 challenge. We did that on legacy vehicles. Why did we do that? Well, we wanted to learn some stuff. We wanted to verify what we believed to be true. So far, we have driven 60 million miles on E30 with no problems, no issues, like zero, like none. And no fuel problems at all. So we wanted to answer 2 questions, and I believe we did. We answered the first question: can you put E30 in a legacy vehicle? Yes, you can. And number 2, will you? Well, guess what? You have a choice. You still have a choice. There's E10 at those pumps, there's E20, there's E30, there's E15, there's E85, all kinds of different things that you can do so that you give the consumer the choices they want. We're not shoving E30 down anybody's throat. We're just making the option available for them. Why not? You know, and I hear a lot of people bitching about the corn price, and yet they don't demand their own product. They don't have E30 on their car. They don't have E30 in their pump. You know what I say to those people? Tough shit. Okay. Number 3, taxpayers are held hostage. You know, it's why the swamp is in the business of picking winners and losers. Taxpayers lose at this game. Big oil is subsidized 7-to-1 to renewables. Freedom Fuel Foundation did a study on this, and it also is in this article. We spend 97 cents a gallon of gasoline defending the Middle East. We spend $1.73 a gallon on the cost of air pollution for health care. 89 cents on climate change, and wherever you land on climate change, I'm not here to debate that. That was their number. And 27 cents on subsidies. So even if you took climate change out, the taxpayer pays more for the gasoline than you pay at the actually pay at the pump. I don't know that that's good policy either. And the foreign policy, number 4, the foreign policy is held hostage. We still import 25% of the gasoline that we use, while being the mall cops of the Middle East. We need oil, they need money. All the while, we're exporting 10% of our product, as was talked about earlier, just so that we can stay in business. And with all of these trade war stuff going on, I sure as heck hope that doesn't drop off anytime soon. So what's my conclusion here? You know, I want us to be free to compete. I want this incestuous relationship of big oil and big government that has marginalized agriculture's contribution to energy independence to be put off to the side. Let's face it, we can never bring political influence to the table that big oil can, not with their 400+ lobbyists. The game is rigged. Big oil is always in the driver's seat. You have to beg and plead just to be hogtied to the top of the car like the dead grandma in the movie Vacation. For those of you that are old enough to remember that, that's kind of where we're at. You know, the RFS, let's come back to that just a minute, was a successful, and it delivered 10% renewable energy nationwide. Washington cronyism has effectively blocked everything we're trying to do to get higher blends, with numerous different roadblocks and political spin. You know, I go to Brazil about every quarter. We put a plant down there and involved in that. Brazil's gasoline is E27, or it's neat, 190 proof. And they look at the two and they compare the price, and the consumer can choose what they want. Now, if ethanol was such a bad fuel and it did so much damage to the cars, why isn't Brazil a junkyard? Where's all these problems? They've got weed eaters, lawnmowers, motorcycles, cars, trucks. They've got all the same stuff we do by the same manufacturers with the same parts, and they work fine. So, you know, this president is in office because of the Midwest ag producers. And he was going to help remove some of the barriers to free market. So far, the Trump administration has done more damage than good with their hardship waivers and no action on RVP. And we're still sitting here waiting for something to happen. Our consumers are smart people. You guys are fully capable of deciding for yourselves what fuel you want to put in your car, as Watertown demonstrated. I conclude with this one proposition here that I think is key and important. Our Midwest states should demand the right to market their own fuel blends in the state without federal roadblocks. Let the free market work for the producer, the retailer, and the consumer. And you say, how can that happen? Why should, well, you know, the past administration put out a letter that said, if you want to legalize controlled substance in your state, we won't come after you. Now, smoking marijuana, growing marijuana, selling marijuana in the U.S. under federal law is still illegal, except for Colorado, now California, and a few other states, because of that letter. We're demanding that the governors join together and get that letter for agriculture for ethanol, because I believe that we can be an effective producer and marketer of our own product, especially and starting from the ground up. I'll finish with one last question to everybody that's here. And this is an ethanol conference. How many of you guys use higher blends in your cars? Thank you. Thank you. For those of you that don't, I would just say, why? We're here promoting our own product. We're out here validating that this product works. Why are we not out there promoting our own product? Why are we not actively getting after, talking to our neighbors, talking to our friends? You know, I wore a Shockers sweatshirt last night just for curiosity, and you know, asked people what was this sweatshirt, and most of them knew Wichita State Shockers. They've done pretty good in basketball. They suck at a lot of other things, but basketball they're pretty good. And you know, I see that in the grocery stores on the streets of Wichita, and if anybody I ask with a Shocker something on, I mean, they are happy to talk about the Wichita State Shockers. Are we that happy to talk about our stuff? Thanks.